Please silence your phone. All right, we are live. And welcome back to Sunday School with Murph. And I'm exhausted. It's been a long day. Filled in at Mount Moriah again this morning and found out their pastor, who's been in the hospital, passed away last night. So please pray for his family and the church as they figure out what to do next and begin looking for another pastor. So it was a good service though, and really weird for me this morning. I woke up at about 2 o'clock or so, couldn't go back to sleep, and when I asked God to help me go back to sleep, he didn't help me go back to sleep. He gave me a message, and that's what I preached. And but we're here. We're doing Sunday school. We're still in 1 Timothy chapter 5 still. We're talking about widows. All right, we were talking last time. All right, so Paul starts out this chapter, Timothy, saying how, let's see here, honor the widows who are truly widows, right? So he makes a distinction. And of course, a widow is any woman who does not have a male heir of some sort. Why does my Bluetooth keep turning on? That is so weird. I don't know how to reset all this stuff. I'm not even using these. But anyways, right, so widows who are truly widows. And again, widows that don't have a male. They don't have a husband, they don't have a son, there is no kinsman redeemer that can come along and take responsibility for and allow them to stay in their homes. It's just the way it was back then. They didn't have the rights to own property and that sort of thing. And so we're going to dig further into that. Let's see here. So he gave a warning to not treat a woman who's young enough to remarry as a true widow, but to make her a widow and put her under the care of the church, but to encourage that woman to go out and find another husband, right? And that's what we're going to do here, chapter 5, verse 11 through 13. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So in other words, they'll have too much time on their hands. And that's the busier we stay in real things, and I don't mean just making stuff up. I don't mean being busybodies, as it's said in here, where we're getting in everybody's business. But the more we are taking care of others, working with others, working for others, the more we're working, the less time we have for stupid stuff, the less time we have to get in trouble. You want to take crime down in the nation? Make sure everybody gets back to work, because you're generally speaking too tired after working a full day to go out and cause trouble. Now, I mean, some people do, but in general, you would see crime numbers go down if everybody had a job, a real meaningful job, not just something where somebody sticks a broom in your hand just cause. I mean, you do what you got to do to support your family, but if that's where you're stuck for the rest of your life, that sucks, right? But in this case, for the widows, they would be put under the care of the church, and they're taking up resources. They're young enough they can go out and remarry and have children and then have security from a new husband, from male children quite possibly. and then they would be secure. They would not be a burden to the church, and their family could take care of them. They could do the right thing and raise more godly people, right? And I got to thinking about this because if you remember back when, right after Christ was born and he was presented at the temple, there was two people waiting for him to show up. A guy named Simeon, and interestingly enough, a woman named Anna, who was a prophetess, which during a time when there's no prophets, you got this lady who's a widow that lives at the temple. And so again, she would be a true widow. No male heirs, no husband, no nothing. And matter of fact, her husband had died after they had been married for 7 years, and she had no male children. And she ends up at the temple for the rest of her life, serving in the temple. And that's fine. That's great. More power to her. But she was told by God that she would see the Messiah. And she was able to prophesy over the Messiah. Right? And so that got me thinking about it. What is going on in the Old Testament? What is Jewish culture? Because I mean, that's, first century church is primarily Jews. What does that say about how to treat widows? And let's see here. We'll go to Exodus chapter 22 first, verses 22 through 24. You must not mistreat any widow or orphan. If you do not mistreat them, and they cry out to me in distress, I will surely hear their cry. My anger will be kindled, and I will kill you with the sword. Then your wives will become widows, and your children will be fatherless. So God takes this pretty seriously. Caring for the least of these. And so a widow who has no support, nobody wants to take up responsibility for her and her belongings, oftentimes would lose everything. Somebody would come in and take it, and she would be thrown out on her keister with nothing to support her, and she's stuck out there with no way to live. And so then they have to turn to slavery or whatever, prostitution or whatever they've got to do. And so if it's not something God wants to see happen, right? So he takes widows seriously. He takes widows and orphans, those who can't provide for themselves and defend for themselves. It's a big deal to God. And so, we need to keep that in mind, that we are looking out for these types of people. They can be easily taken advantage of. Let's see here. Deuteronomy 26:12 says this: when you have finished laying aside a tenth of all your produce in the third year, the year of the tithe, you are to give it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, that they may eat and be filled within your gates. Again, take care of the widows. So that's Hebrew law. That's, you got it in Exodus, you got it in Deuteronomy. And so one of the best indicators of a good society, of a healthy society, spiritually, is how you treat the least of these, how you treat the lowest people in the society, whatever that looks like. Now, obviously, today we have Social Security, which is not much, really. The government likes to jerk people around with that, but then there's also life insurance, because people have life insurance and whatnot. So you have women who are taken care of financially and provided for, and they don't, our society, you don't have to be a man to own something. A woman can have her own business and that sort of thing. So a widow today would be able to provide for herself, whereas they wouldn't back 2,000 years ago. And so you still, now obviously you get up in age, you get into your 70s and 80s, and it becomes more difficult. And but we hear about all the time, there's elder abuse going on everywhere. And so you don't want that to happen. And and then unfortunately you see kids that take advantage of their parents when they're in their old age, if they're starting to lose it, or um, come under ill health. So you want to make sure that you have a good grounding as to what a society, morally speaking, should do for people who can't do for themselves, and you want to make sure they're protected, which is exactly what's going on here. Now, again, if you're a young enough woman and you're put under the care of the church, well, at some point you're going to lose. If you're young enough, you're going to catch somebody's going to catch your eye, or there'll be somebody you might want to pursue. And then if you're doing something in the church, now all of a sudden you're not doing it, and so then that's going to cause a problem. And so rather than setting someone up permanently as a ward of the church to be cared for that way, find that woman a husband so that she can have children and so that she can have males and have security and live a comfortable life serving her family and serving God in that capacity. All right, so verses 14 through 16. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander, for some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. So again, limited resources. If they're capable of finding a husband and remarrying and having children, make it happen. Help them find somebody. Maybe they're a little bit older, but they're capable of going and helping someone else who's a widow or some other family that needs a mother. They can be put into that type of situation. And so you would be able to, again, provide for their care without putting burden upon the church, without putting burden upon your resources. That's one of the things with the early church is you didn't have the temple. Like when Paul was run out of the Sanhedrin and he was no longer a Pharisee, and he lost access to, if he needed money, he just sent a message to the temple in Jerusalem, and he'd go to a synagogue somewhere and he would get some money and he would go do what he needed to do. He could no longer do that. So what did he have to do? He had to provide for himself. He had to rely on the churches he started. He had to rely on the other believers. At one point, he even resorted to becoming a tent maker. And so, that's what's going on there, right? But the early church had limited funds. And so it can become expensive caring for somebody. And it's a difficult thing. But again, make sure the true widows are widows. Make sure that if they're young enough to remarry and to move on and start a new life, do that so that you're able to keep doing the things you need to be doing. That's one of the things, like I mentioned a few weeks ago, is the reason the first deacons got called was to care for the widows and the orphans, because the first apostles needed to study and preach and teach. And so if their time was taken up dealing with all these widows who at the time were being neglected, and like I said, the Old Testament tells the Jews, take care of your widows or I'm going to be ticked and you're going to suffer for it. So not only was it the morally right thing to do, it was also Jewish law. And of course, the first century Jews, I guess you could call them Messianic, but at the same time, they were the first Christians. They were all Jews, and so there was a release from the law to an extent, but they still had aspects of it that they clung to in order to still be able to stand before Jews that didn't believe in Messiah. And so the last thing they needed was their witness being ruined because somebody comes along and points a finger at them and blames them for something that's in Jewish law. That's why Paul had Timothy circumcised, so that he would be able to stand before Jews and witness to and preach and teach Jews and still be respected and not looked down upon as a Gentile dog, as they would have said, even though he was a half-breed. Let's see here. So that's a big part of the church, taking care of those who can't care for themselves, widows and orphans. Really anybody, someone who's an invalid or someone who has some disability where they can't actually work. I mean, it's nice to have the government do certain things, but the government shouldn't do everything. And we can't do everything because we have limited resources, but we can do what we can do, and that's what we need to figure out. So, encourage people to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, that's another thing too. Treat them right so that when you're old and you got to rely on your kids or your grandkids, they're going to take care of you because they saw you taking care of your parents and grandparents. That's really it for today. Now I got started late, even with starting late at 5 p.m., but I didn't get much sleep this morning, and I am tired. So next week, I will be back here in the morning. There's another gentleman, they had already made arrangements for him to fill in over there at Mount Moriah, and so there's a possibility that I'll be called in the future to fill in again, but we'll see what God does with that, and continue to pray for Mount Moriah, their congregation. Brother Ken's brother Paul is on the tail end of pancreatic cancer, so he's over in Georgia. Please pray for his brother and his family. His daughter's taking care of him. Just that they would be able to have peace and that God's light would shine and that he would be the focus of everything, and that everybody would be able to honor God in dealing with his illness and in dealing with the mourning that's coming soon. So again, be in prayer for them, be in prayer for the church out there. Brother Rex, and I wish I knew his last name. He had a family that his daughter managed to make it into town last night. So be in prayer for them, and this is Murph. I'm still tired, and I'm still going to tell you to go forth and make disciples. I will see you next time.